Welcome to the GreenPilled.network podcast. In September, GreenPill will be hosted by the Cartographers, a high-context community of individuals and teams dedicated to advancing the Web3 grants ecosystem. They'll explore the Web3 grants ecosystem with topics ranging from novel funding mechanisms, grant councils, and governance to emerging trends like AI and direct-to-contract incentives. This series seeks to bridge theory and practice by examining real-world examples and featuring discussions with those who are closest to the action. The next voice you hear will be Sav, who contributes at Gitcoin and founded the Cartographers. Sav will be hosting this entire season, and I think that it's going to be a great season because Sav brings deep experience in Web3 grants and capital allocation. I'm excited for you to hear some of the perspectives from him and his guests. Without further ado, the next voice you'll hear is Sav. Enjoy!
All right, welcome, guys. It's good to have you on the show today. I'll jump in and do some introductions. Shawn, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, you bet, Sav. Great to be here with you today. And yeah, I'm looking forward to today's conversation. Quick introduction. I've been introduced to blockchain 2015, full-time in crypto since 2017, and working in the grant space for probably about the past 3 years. Spent some time over at Index Co-op learning how to do governance, spent some time over at Gitcoin doing governance. And now I work over at an organization called Thrive Protocol, where we believe in a world where anybody who creates value should be justly rewarded for their contribution. And that means that we focus on our partners. We want the top blockchain ecosystems. We help them maximize their treasury impact. And we also look for the best builders, and we help the best builders get the funding they need so they can make a difference in Web3. So Saab, I'm really excited to be here and have the conversation with you and Bernard today.
Nice. Bernard, give us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, 100%. And yeah, thanks first of all for orchestrating stuff. I think great format and big fan, obviously bringing people together in this space more and more. Myself, I'm Bernard, co-founder of Areta. We are a strategy firm in governance, if you will. So we work with a lot of foundations and sometimes DAOs directly to build effective governance systems. And what it really means is a couple of larger topics that we're typically involved in are governance design, capital allocation, growth, which I think grants falls under, and then larger strategic initiatives wherever foundations or DAOs want to take a step back and really think through more complex problems. More public work, I think you see in the spaces in Uniswap and Arbitrum, Safe and Aave, and then we have some more direct involvements with other ecosystems on the side. Our little edge, and this is where it sometimes is a bit difficult explaining the whole setup, is that we're connected to an investment banking firm in crypto where we support founders on financial transactions. And this is M&A, larger token launches or secondaries. Obviously, sometimes tough to understand, but you can think of me as the governance guy with a team attached. I think the grants thing for us is a very interesting one. We started out with developing a cross-ecosystem grants program, but really from a conceptual angle and thinking through, how to design a new type of grant program. And then really got more into the weeds of, how to set up operations that work more seamlessly. And since then, going deeper and deeper and now landed here with you too, and looking forward to the episode.
Nice. Well, anyone that knows me knows that grants is something near and dear to my heart. I probably need better hobbies. But I'm excited to talk with you both about this today. I spend a lot of my time working around this subject. So yeah, let's jump into it. So today we're going to be talking about the spectrum of grant services. Really what this comes from is, for any that's been in the space any amount of time, many of the grant programs really started with the Ethereum Foundation and some of those organizations that started, grants across Web3. And now there's literally hundreds of programs today. Some of those programs are more traditional grant programs giving out direct grants. Some of those use novel funding mechanisms. And then some of those are even convertible grants, equity-based, or they're looking at different ways that they can allocate incentives, even at a contract level. So as we've seen that proliferation of different programs, you're also seeing a trend around service providers in the space. So service providers around treasury management, professional delegates, DAO governance. But this episode's really about grant services and grants as a service. As you see more incentives and grant programs proliferate, more and more organizations are looking at ways that they can either augment or fully outsource the function of grants to another organization. And that's kind of what the three of us do in different ways with the organizations we represent here. So first, I think let's jump into it. And this is a question I've got for you, Shawn, because I definitely want to hear your answer to it. Maybe your perspective on like, what are the challenges faced by in-house grant organizations today? Teams that have TGE, or they've got a treasury that they've got to look to allocate. They're thinking about the best ways to allocate that. Obviously, grants is, something top of mind for many of those. What are the challenges that you see, and how are you seeing them address those?
It's funny. It's like I belong to an organization called the Grant Professionals Organization, and it's an in real life professional organization here located in the US. And they have a lot of the same problems that we do in Web3. They've just had more time to document those problems. But if we think about it, the centralization of making all these decisions can mean that it could be either efficient or it could be inefficient. And what I'm seeing in Web3 is it's horribly inefficient. If we look at the ROI on our grant programs, it's terrible. And that could be any number of reasons, from we're not clear on what business objective we're trying to drive forward. We're not clear on what the objective is. We're not clear on our vision. We're not clear on our mission. We're not clear on which one of the strategies should be driven forward. So that could be one case. Another case could be that we don't have the right decision makers deciding how to allocate those funds. And as a result, we're giving money to the wrong projects. The final piece that I'll mention is we're not clear on what success is. And what that means is I can go give away hundreds of thousands of tokens, but at the end of the day, what did I really get out of those hundreds of thousand tokens? And in some cases, I've heard, hey, we spent money for a great party. Yeah, you got something out of the party. You made some great relationships, but is that spend necessarily better than that app that was developed that no one's ever going to see? So there's a litany of problems that we're struggling with in Web3. The silver lining, I will say, is if I go and compare ourselves to my peers at the Grant Professional Association, we are putting in changes way faster than the in real life world. So the problems that we're struggling with right now, we're going to solve them in record time. And I think there's going to be a time when IRL is going to come back to us and say, my gosh, look at what they're doing over here. And they're going to learn from us. That's what I'm excited about what we're doing at Thrive Protocol too, is like having the ability to connect the builders, the funders, and the community all together in a way that all three of them win. And at some point in time, Web2 and IRL is going to pay attention to us. And that's going to be part of the rocket that gets 3 billion crypto users.
Totally. Yeah. Grants I definitely see as something that on the surface, many can look at it as marketing, maybe like a veiled form of, VC. But when done correctly and you understand the ROI that you want to get out of it, you can make some pretty good impact. And with the fact that we have one chain, we have these transparent systems, we have the potential to be able to surface that kind of impact, verifiable metrics, really better than any other space today, right? I also agree that the community in Web3 around grants, kind of the grant nerds like ourselves and others out there, it's a passionate community, where we're definitely looking at ways that we can solve these things and improve. To touch on the ROI topic, right? That's something I'd like to turn over to you, Bernard, especially with your background. Like when you think about, ROI, like what are some things that you've thought through at Areta? Maybe give some examples of some of the programs you've worked with. I asked this because I saw the reports from UAGP and the grant program that Areta ran there. And I was pretty impressed with kind of like how you define that at the outset and that you've been tracking towards that ROI, for that program over time.
100%, and couldn't agree more on some of the things that Shawn obviously mentioned. And I think we are very nascent states when it comes to grants in crypto still, right? Like we try to learn a lot from the traditional ecosystem. We have good instances of collaboration, meeting IRL at conferences, and I think these are always super fruitful discussions, and we're getting there. But it's baby steps, right? And I think there are a lot of things to improve still. So ROI, I think the high level thought that we always have is more tailoring to specific demands. And when saying that, I mean, I think what we've done a long time in crypto is this like one size fits all. Okay, grants. You need to give out grants to builders, support builders, give out a token, somehow fuel growth through that. So that approach was taken from one ecosystem to the other with like little, iterations overall. We have new funding mechanisms and so on, and are experimenting a lot. But still, when it comes to thinking from first principles, I think we can do a better job. And what we typically do, and I think you guys as well on the coincide with the grants model canvas, which I think is a great approach, is really thinking through, okay, why are we doing grants, right? And it's not always ecosystem growth. Another case might be we want to raise awareness of the ecosystem. We want to raise engagement in the community. Sometimes it's even more nuanced and thinking through, okay, we want to establish bonds with another ecosystem, or we might even have a financial return interest, as you mentioned before. There are new, mechanisms thinking through that. So what we typically try to do is getting really clear in type of objectives before starting out, and then really differentiating in terms of what do we want to achieve as a program and set ourselves metrics, and then what should achieve as grantees, and then hold us to it, right? And I think this is the toughest part. And it's a movement right now, I feel, in the market that people come more to the realization, okay, we actually should be more rigorous, although it's always very normie, very Web 2, right? Like, who are the guys tracking and reporting? It's this like boring thing nobody wants to hear, right? But I think we are very, big proponent, and also now you guys on your side, Shawn, are doing more and more in that regard. So that's, I think amazing to see, to put a bit more of this rigor in, tracking meaningful metrics and reporting them to the outside, into what we all do to move away from that. Okay, let's spray out funds and then we're happy because we've done something.
Totally. Yeah. I'd like to talk a little bit about the evolution and how we got here. As I mentioned earlier, it really started with EF. There were some early Bitcoin grants, Zcash, others. But as the Ethereum ecosystem has proliferated, and other ecosystems like Solana, you've seen grant programs really start to scale. And it really started where I started to see grant councils spinning up. I think Aave is a really good example of that early on, when it was Llama and the team over there that proposed the first Aave grants DAO, and, spinning that up. And, you started to see more of a trend that way, where it wasn't necessarily a separate service provider taking on, the outsourcing of grant programs, but, there started to be ways that taking on more of the elements of grants and incentives and these types of things were decentralized out to the community. And then over time, as that approach has grown, you've seen the rise of different service providers. And I think that there's a range of those. On the Gitcoin side of things, like, we're primarily known for developing novel mechanisms, helping people to fund what matters to them, as we say, but then more and more creating a services layer on top of that to make sure people use the tools well, they achieve the impact that they want. And then when you take that up a layer, there's kind of like the process side of it, right? Like, how do you optimize, drive efficiencies? And ultimately there's the people layer, where, consulting and advisory type services. So if you get to kind of that model, right, of people, process, technology, maybe starting on the technology side, talking a little bit, from the Gitcoin side of things, and how that relates to verifiable impact, which I think is what you guys are doing really well at Thrive Protocol today, right? I know personally, and as someone who worked, contributed to Gitcoin as well, Shawn, sometimes there's questions around quadratic funding, right? And like, how were those funds allocated, well, and is there ways that we can kind of verify the impact of those over time, right? So could you maybe talk a little bit about like what Thrive does, what the verifiable impact means to you, and how that approach could even be applied to different funding mechanisms to kind of lend credibility, show the ROI, those types of things?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's a couple different vectors that are crossing there. One of those, which I appreciate about quadratic funding, is the ability for the community to help decide what should be funded, and also the interesting weighting that the algorithm behind quadratic funding, which allows the whales to be somewhat a little bit dampened, and the volume of potentially the minnows actually escalating their voice. I appreciate that. And the reason why that's important is that the technology helps us to not over-index on any one specific stakeholder group. And I think that's what's interesting about quadratic funding, what I appreciated always about Gitcoin. Now, I think that's the interesting component about where we are in this Web3 space, is we do have the ability to quickly iterate on different types of algorithms that are appropriate for the specific use cases. However, even if we have communities making decisions in using different algorithms, are we rewarding at the right point in time? Now, what I mean by that is, are we rewarding people, or are we paying grantees at the point of impact when they're delivering value? That becomes the challenge. And what I mean by that is, if we're clear up front with our grantees to say, you are going to be rewarded on this milestone, this milestone, this milestone, and here are the characteristics that are required for that milestone, we can then take those grantees who are achieving milestones and continue to fund them throughout their cycle, as opposed to go do some work, show me a report, and then you get a big pile of cash, right? Which is a great way of destroying a lot of value. One of the things that we're proud of at what we do at Thrive Protocol is for those foundations, for those DAOs who are recognizing that, grants may not be their core competency, and it could be more of a distraction, and it could be an expensive distraction. Our ability to come in and say, we understand, or with the client, we help to understand what are they trying to drive. We'll go help bring those builders, use their community to validate when those builders have reached those points of value creation and they should be rewarded. And so being clear up front, what needs to be happening in each one of the milestones. And if you hit that milestone, you can demonstrate it, and the community agrees with whatever that badge holder could be, whether that's a council, whether that's a small group of subject matter experts, or whether that's a community at large. At that point in time, we are able to make a decision of, was value delivered? And if the value was delivered, we can make the payment. By taking that approach, it becomes abundantly clear where people are developing product that is actually going to be used, and where there's lots of vaporware. We can identify those a lot faster.
Yeah. Maybe talk me through a little bit on the verifiable impact side. Like, what does that actually look like with Thrive today? How are you achieving that? How does the protocol kind of technology, work? And then what's the people and process layer that sits on top of that?
So it's interesting, as we go through and mature through the different algorithms that we're using and through the technology that we're building, I'll start at a very basic layer. So for example, one of our milestones could be at milestone 3, you need to take a product. If there's a builder, are you moving from testnet to mainnet, right? And if you're on milestone number 3 and your milestone says, I have run my series of tests and we're now moving to mainnet, we can verify that on chain and say, okay, you've completed that step. And in addition to that, if we're say at the point of at testnet, what tests were run, who in the community actually participated in those tests. And we have the ability to incentivize testers in the community to go in and use the product that these people are developing and say, is it working? Yes or no? So that's part of the problem that builders have, is that they can create a great product, but they don't have the great testing mechanisms, or they don't have the builders, or they don't have the users who are going to go use this thing. We can help bring those people together. Remember, I mentioned that we can bring together the foundations, the people who need to get work done, the builders who need the funding, and also the community, the rabid fans who want to go help the community move forward, bringing those together to say, help us evaluate, has this met its milestone or not? And if it has met the milestone, they get paid. If it hasn't met the milestone, all right, let's keep working at it. Or if you're unable to do it, let's cut that project at that point in time versus wait until the very end and pay out a big bunch of cash.
Interesting. Bernard, when you hear all that, how does kind of verifying that impact, milestones, those types of things, work on your side today? And what's the potential you see maybe over the next year?
I think what we found generally, and when I think about this, what should be manual, what should be automated, that's always in my hand. And I know you guys are probably on the side of like building this huge, infrastructure on top, which I really appreciate also, to plug in at times and so on. We always think about when you design a program that needs to be custom made, that needs to be very manual. So that's the first step. The second step in terms of execution, processes, reporting and so on, ideally standardized to the max. And then the third layer, knowledge or insight generation, needs to be manual again. So how we think about it in the end is the first step of, customizing. We need to be what the program should be, and also what the outcome metrics should be for one specific program needs to be very manual. And what we typically do is, taking our time, talking with the foundation, with key stakeholders in the DAO, with the research team, with builders and so on, to really figure out where the grant programs sit and then define those outcome metrics based on that. And these can be very different from one grant program to the other, depending on, what needs to be achieved, and can, vary widely from community satisfaction score on awareness creation on the one side of the spectrum to decent TVL on a very tangible quantitative measure on the other side of the spectrum, really depending on the grant program. I think the key thing that we found when it comes to reporting these metrics is, while standardizing the process and making it as easy as possible for the operator, but also the grantees to report and to put this in a standardized format, and ideally that format is not only standard in the one grant program in a DAO, but across 5 programs in a DAO, which we aren't there yet. But I think that's the vision, at least we have, to not, create a burden for people to trying to, dedicate their mind space for every new grant program and come up needing to read through different measuring metrics and so on. What we really found helpful after reporting is taking a manual approach again at the 3rd level and really digesting on what came out of this. Because the tricky thing is, what we're trying to do is we try to put 50 builders in our predefined box, and the box might not always be fit for purpose, right? It's this like analogy, or I think the story with, I don't know if you know it, the penguin in the school that the teacher says you're rated by flying and everybody else flies and the penguin can't fly, but he has other qualities, right? So I think the 3rd level, before we are at this fully automated version, we always have to, consider the outcomes in your perspective and consider what has been done, what hasn't been done, and so on. And it's quite nuanced at times. So we don't want to wave kind of the flag, okay, you've done it, you haven't done it, you get the money, you don't get the money, but really also making space for people to do meaningful work that might not fit the boxes or might go sideways 2 months in. We all have to remain that flexibility. And I think that's a big part of the work that we're somehow trying to fit in, balancing standardization and manual assessment. And I think we're always on the verge on being too manual at times, but I think that you can see in our reports in terms of the, blood and sweat that goes into some of the creation of those.
It's apparent, for sure, right? For sure. And that actually kind of leads me into the next question a little bit. When you talk about clients and kind of service that way, I'm curious from both of you, like, how do you find your clients? What does that sales process look like when you engage with them? Yeah, so maybe give the audience a little bit of perspective that way. Maybe I'll start with you, Bernard.
The framing of this already with like BD or deal flow, the grants part of our whole unit is more, I would say, whenever it makes sense. And what I mean by that is what we typically try to do. And I think from what I've been observing from the outside, Tribe is doing a similar approach, but we really want to be engaged in the ecosystems that we work with. And you can see that in Arbitrum, where we don't only run a grant program, but we also done a strategy sprint on M&A. And we've also are now in discussions and thinking through a financial strategy for the DAO. So our approach is more, we serve specific DAOs or ecosystems on a strategy layer. If there is a case for capital allocation or grants programs that need to be improved or revamped, then we like to come in, because what we always see is you need to have, and I know it's a meme by now, high context. Nobody likes to use the word anymore, but you need to have high context in the end and knowing what's going on, who are the stakeholders, where did we head in the last 6 months, so what do we need to change? And only then I think we start to think through, okay, is a grant program a case here or it isn't, right? So we have less this like sales BD approach, but more, just applying it when it makes sense. And if not, we try to fix other problems that are more apparent in a specific ecosystem.
That's you, Shawn. What's your perspective on that?
So it's interesting. I'll say that there is a certain maturation process that has to happen before clients are ready for services like ours. I think in Web3, there is no lack of confidence, but sometimes there's a lack of competence, right? And it takes a certain amount of understanding from a DAO or from a leader to realize that we've got plenty of people that are willing to jump in and do the work, but are they really going to do they have the skill set necessary and required to go do the work? We've got brilliant people in Web3, and given enough time, they're going to figure it out. By using a service provider, you can skip that learning phase and go right to the ability to quickly make an impact very fast. And that's really where our deal flow starts, is understanding what their business needs really are. And in many cases, helping them to articulate what that business need is. I won't say it's the first time they've done it, but we try to do it with a fine enough point to where we're clear and they're clear. When we get to the point of agreeing on what the metrics are, then if we nail those metrics, it should be a no-brainer. They should be necessarily happy. They should be happy with the work that we're delivering. And sometimes it takes a bit of that because, especially in the DAO world, you've got 6 different people and maybe they're not completely aligned with what the organizational objectives are, right? So starting first with getting clear is, what is the organizational objectives? Understanding, are they trying to build community? Are they trying to drive community? Or are they trying to bring builders to the ecosystem? Or Are they looking for, as Bernard had mentioned, almost like a marketing function, right? So it's understanding what their real needs are. Based on that, using our common approach, we can address any one of those three needs, helping to get capital allocation quickly reached, helping to bring community in and engaging the community, or based on the 140-some thousand contributors and builders already in our system, we've got a short path to reach to the builders and bring them into brand new ecosystems. The beauty about this is that at some point, Web3 is going to get to the point to where we recognize the power of the network. And that means someone like Bernard, who's a governance expert, doesn't need to be only working with one protocol. We'll have governance experts that can work across many different protocols, and we'll have builders that are working across many different protocols. And that's where the power of Web3 is going to come from. And that's what I'm excited about.
I definitely find it interesting with my background, worked at a traditional systems integrator, and even in our largest clients, they were centralized. You were talking to the director of IT or the C-suite, right? I find it interesting that in Web3, there are some very large clients that are foundations, more centralized organizations, but some of the ones that have the highest propensity for grant programs, you have 1,000 customers, right? Because it's like everyone in the DAO, you have the foundation, you have labs, you have current stakeholders. I mean, it's a very different approach. I find it exciting personally. It's chaotic at times, right? And sometimes maybe it doesn't seem fair, if that's a fair way to put it, but it's different type of approach, that's needed, especially in some of those larger organizations. And I know, both you guys have great perspectives on that, right? You talk about interoperability, Shawn, and I think that just as we're building systems that are interoperable, I mean, that's kind of like the promise of on-chain. I think that, these teams can be interoperable. And we've even seen that, from a Gitcoin perspective, working with both of your organizations. Hopefully soon we'll see an opportunity where it's the three of us together, right? Working on an opportunity that way. So maybe kind of touch on that a little bit. Like, what do you view as like the collaboration between service providers? How does that look? And Bernard, maybe asking you that question because you're very active in the DAO governance space, and grants being only kind of like part of what you do, but you also have like the treasury, the DAO governance side of things. I mean, how do you view collaboration, and like what's the challenges right now to that, and what's the potential you see in Web3 between service providers?
It's an interesting one also to seeing that unfold right now in the space in terms of, where people are heading. When in the beginning, many, start with this, like, okay, we are running grant programs, and then you see very nuanced developments on specializations across the ecosystem. Generally, what we believe, or we are a strong believer in this thesis of being the best in what you do, and ideally then plug in the pieces together. And what I mean by that, and that refers a bit to what I mentioned before, right? Like on the design or strategic side, we like to come in and think things from first instance and think through, okay, there's a new type of grant program we want to set up. The cross-ecosystem grant program that we've done for Uniswap Arbitrum is an example where we thought, okay, what does a grant program look like that has the dual mission of benefiting two ecosystems and should strengthen the bonds? So really that conceptual layer, strategizing, can mean anything, but really designing a grant program fit for purpose. When it then comes to curation, we might not be the best in the weeds, right? You need a group of people with technical abilities or deeper technical understanding on different RFPs that we might have framed out. So ideally, you plug in people that are more knowledgeable than us and are more specialized on the service to be plugged in. And that I think you can think through on all the different elements of a good grant program, right? Like to make the example or close example here, the grant stack or the infrastructure behind it is obviously also not our strong stance, but your strong stance, right? And this is how we collaborated in the past, really working together, and we share our demands or insights from what we need from a practical perspective, and you share your insights in, what's technically possible and how can we make this, work like a machine with these different parts together. To also close the loop with Shawn to, make him part of the party. How it worked also in the past, I think you guys have a very unique approach on, being the first layer, working directly with the foundation, taking a larger chunk of capital, and then really think to, okay, what should be 5 sub-programs, right? And I think you label it pluralistic grants, and sorry if that's the wrong use of the word, but that's how I always understood it. And we then really come in at a layer and thinking through what these programs should be on a very, specialized level. So I think in that regard, the kind of house builds itself together with the right elements, and we're a big fan of specializing on these things to really create the biggest value. I think the challenge here is obviously collaboration. Can mean a lot of things, but in the end, our experience is working repetitively with similar providers obviously creates a lot of value over time. And the first project might be a bit, you might stumble a bit. Working styles need to align. We're all human beings. We all have different cultures in our organizations. And we might run our businesses very differently. So the first or second project is still this getting to know phase for us. But then the more you work together over months and years, the more seamless this house or machinery can work together, even with 5 different parts in it. And yeah, I think this is really also the beauty of the space. The ways are short. Everybody knows each other. We meet each other in IRL. I think it's just a lot of fun and like plugging that together and testing it out if it works or if it doesn't work.
Do you have any perspectives on that, Shawn? I know that, Thrive, in my opinion, sits at an interesting place, as Bernard mentioned, around, kind of being almost like a connective tissue, right? In terms of like collaboration where you have, the funding, if it's visualized in my mind, it's kind of like the funding mechanism beneath Thrive in many ways, right? Like how the capital is actually allocated, whether that be a direct grant or some more novel funding mechanism. And then you have more of, the people layer above Thrive and how you're verifying that impact and matching, that impact to how the capital was allocated and kind of like, surfacing some of those outcomes, right?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Our approach at Thrive Protocol is recognizing that, we exist to help these blockchain communities maximize the ROI on their treasury allocation. But in addition to that, as I mentioned before, it's like giving those builders an outlet to express their creativity and deliver that new novel mechanism that's going to bring that 3 billion normies to crypto, right? Which is what we all need. And in addition to that, helping those communities to get engaged and to create value, even on an individual one-on-one, one contribution at a time micro scale. Now, the thing is, like, those communities, those builders, and those networks, those blockchain communities, they don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a total Web3 ecosystem. And right now, our total Web3 ecosystem is tiny compared to in real life, right? So there's a couple different vectors. One is recognizing it is true that all tides will lift all of our boats, right? And there is so much work to be done that there is no reason for any one of us to be in direct competition with each other because we're not. We're in competition to bring all of those 3 billion users into crypto. That's what our objective is. And we all should be focused on that, not taking bits and pieces from each other. That's not the point, right? Part of that network effect is recognizing where we are today, having those close relationships. Saab, we worked together. Bernard, we met together. And we just happened to be all in a podcast together, right? It's part of the unique circumstance of where we are in this watershed moment and this technology and this ethos that I think is really going to change the world. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really excited to be here, because we have the mechanisms, right? We've got the technology, we've got the ethos that's in place, and we're struggling through historical baggage of how do we learn to behave as a network versus a series of individual enterprises. So sorry, Sal, that was probably a little bit more philosophical than you were looking for, but that's kind of how we think about it.
There's right on, man. That was excellent, right? I definitely see, like, even, talking with friends when I explain what I do, when you mention you work in crypto, the automatic assumption is that you're some kind of day trader, right? And so to be able to kind of like explain, no, it's capital allocation, right? And there's, when a treasury is generated, there's only so many things you can do, with the tokens in that treasury. And, grants is like an essential part. Grants and incentives, an essential part of growth in the crypto ecosystem. I also find it interesting that with traditional grant giving organizations, many of them are pegged to fiat currencies, right? Which aren't as subject to the ups and downs that you see with tokens in a treasury, right? And so every time you disperse one of those grants, you're creating sell pressure, right? Or you may be. And so it's that much more important that you make sure that the ROI is there, and ultimately it has positive impacts over time to the ecosystem versus negative impacts, or that could have, a real hit to kind of just like treasury value and sustainability over time, right? So the last part I want to jump into is the one that I've been looking forward to the most, right? Is like, to quote Owaki, since I'm sitting in his chair doing the podcast, he uses the term a lot, like, where is the puck going, right? And really what that refers to is like, where are we going with all of this, from the crypto kind of grants and incentives side of things. For me personally, I'm very interested in more kind of like the side of direct contract incentives, intense markets, more automating incentives based on the on-chain impact, some of the things that we talked about earlier. I also see more of a trend around convertible grants. And so, as ecosystems develop, they want to have some way that those grant funds could potentially be converted into equity and provide returns, back to the ecosystem. You even see Optimism doing some interesting things with the super chain and, wanting super chain partners that may receive some of those off incentives over time to, pay that back. And then that benefits the whole of the collective, right? And so those are some of the things that I'm watching and I find most interesting. I'd be curious both of your perspectives on that. So maybe Bernard, I'll start with you.
Yeah, 100%. And it's funny, I had to smile a bit when you mentioned the convertibles idea, because largely I think where the puck is moving is to more tangible value creation. And it's obviously a big word, but I think the big movement is, okay, in the past, we've just allocated a lot of grants. Kind of you need to have a grant program as an ecosystem. Let's allocate a bunch of million of grants and then everybody's happy, right? I think the big movement now is the question is ours. And it's a bit similar to, VC when the crypto market is down. Suddenly they want to see traction. Suddenly they want to see what's actually happening with our funds. And I think we are at the point with grant programs in the market that this is where we see a lot of the conversations heading. And I think it's twofold. One is obviously on the operations side, where personally, obviously very excited about, might seem boring for other people, but really institutionalizing tracking, and reporting, finding new standards of measuring outcome, and then finding new standards of also reporting the outcome, moving away from classical forum posts that nobody wants to read because they read 10 forum posts a day to, more digestible pieces, reports, or automated tracking embedded in a dashboard and so on. So I think that's one part. And the second part is also new grant mechanisms as part of value creation. I think one is, different funding designs, and there are the poster boys of crypto retro. I don't know if it's even hot anymore, or if there's another hotter thing right now. But then also conversations about not only wanting to see value in terms of outcome, but sometimes also financially. And I think there it becomes really interesting. And you mentioned convertible grants into equity is a hot topic that also we've been discussing more and more lately. Really thinking through, okay, what can the next level of grant programs look like that maybe have the aim also for immediate financial value generation, and turning grants into equity, and then supporting grantees to raise VC funds and taking a part of the grants as shares in the company. And then also on other ends, more direct payouts connected to protocol additions or contracts people are developing. So baking in fees that feed into a grant pool again to create self-sustaining grant programs is also something that I think is picking up more very early. Nobody has done it ever, but I think this idea of financially self-sustaining grant programs or financially rewarded grant programs is certainly something that, I think we will hear more from in the near future.
What are your thoughts, Shawn?
I think Bernard put it extremely well. And so, Bernard, I'm going to echo a couple of things that you had mentioned in a slightly different format, but I think you're very spot on when you mentioned that we need to get better at rewarding value creation, right? And that's it. We need tangible value creation, and that's what we need to reward, and that's what we need to pay for. We need to get better at doing that. And I think most of the grant providers and most of those working in grants get that and are moving towards the ability to say, what makes sense to reward versus what makes sense not to reward. And let's get better at that. And let's cut out all the symbols and cut out all the same project that's been dipping the same thing in 16 different places, right? So let's get better at making rewarding people at the point of value creation. I think in our space, innovation is just going to happen, right? And I see in the grant space, there's so many different ideas that are being run right now. Innovation is going to happen. The thing that I think that is going to be a tipping point at some point is people will say, hey, so after the grant has been done and after some kind of impact has been done, how are we scaling what has been built? Because builders can build, but they don't know how to scale always, right? That's the piece that I think we've missed. And I think that's going to become a new focal point, not this year, probably next year. Once we've finished getting really clear on rewarding people who are actually creating value, then we're going to recognize that they need help scaling, right? We need to help them bring users to whatever they create to help them get that product, to get critical mass, to get momentum behind it. So it becomes the next Uniswap, because I'm pretty sure we've developed the next Uniswap, which is sitting someplace unused. What we need to do is we need to stop that. So we need to say, if we've got this big pool of projects, execute the big pool of projects, rewarded value creation, and that 10% that can change the world, let's put some fire, let's dump some gasoline on that. Let's make those things explode. I think that's what we're going to see. Not this year, probably next year, because that's the point to where we can start bringing in, I'll go back, we're not building for Web 3. We need to be building for Web 2. We need to be building for those people who are outside our own ecosystems and don't go to the conferences. And the way to do that is find the projects that are developing for that and dump gas on them.
Yeah, and I definitely see a lot of potential. I mean, even when you think about open source software, I mean, I'm an idealist that way. I think that crypto in many ways is kind of like the natural evolution of this open source software progression that we've seen for decades now. And even with all of like the human progress, right, that's been associated to that over the last 20 or 30 years, open source software still mostly relies on legacy fundraising mechanisms, and it's largely underfunded. I mean, that was in many ways kind of like the impetus for Gitcoin, right? It was like Kevin realizing that open source software devs are under incentivized for the work they do, and surely there's a way that crypto can help them to get coins, right? And I think to your earlier point, Shawn, there's definitely a passion, in the industry right now around this group where we still have a long way to go. But I think that the systems that we're building and just the focus that we're putting on the topics of grants and incentives and impact and how do we do better that way could surprise people. And it could be one of those things that, really crosses the chasm, right, as it were, from crypto to kind of like IRL in terms of ways that crypto can really contribute and grow the world in a positive way, right? At least that's my hope. So we're actually over on time, which means we had a great episode. So we'll get to the wrapping it up here. Key takeaways, right? So Bernard, I guess to turn it over to you, if there was one key takeaway you would kind of have from this episode and just the work that you do that you'd like to leave the audience with, what would that be?
It's not necessarily a key takeaway from our discussion, but I think what it all boils down, and I think it's a bit a human argument in terms of collaboration. What we're discussing now is very nuanced, right? Like all of us face similar things on a daily when we go through the different layers of what we're working on, right? Like we design programs, we manage them or execute on them, and then we learn from them. What I found, and I think I shared this observation also with you, is that every time we come together IRL and somebody's hosting a great workshop, there's a lot of things that we are taking away. But then we go into our little silos again and like heads down, grind through until the next conference. There are obviously many instances, and all of us are working on more platforms and collaboration mechanisms that we set up regular calls and do more knowledge sharing and so on. But I think this is something that is such a low hanging fruit still, and can boost a lot of the value creation still, because in the end we're working on similar problems. Everybody has very nuanced view on different topics, and this says, and I think we're all firm believers of the rising tide floats all boat theory, right? We're super early. There are 110 problems to be fixed that we all think about in the morning under the shower every morning. And I think it's just a crucial time now to get together more and push each other, achieving them and solving individual parts of this. And yeah, I think that's the thing I always have top of mind, and very exciting future obviously ahead. I think in the next, friends always ask me, how early are you guys in crypto and like grants and so on, right? Like, and I still believe it's like 5 years 10 years down the road to be something that we all can be super proud of and say, okay, that's a very well-oiled machine in grants now, and we figured it out. So, very excited to be on the journey also together with you guys for the years to come.
Well put. Shawn, what about you?
I think the key takeaway for me is for the community to recognize the objective is not distributing grant funds. The objective is rewarding value creation. And when we get to that point of recognizing that's the turning point, then we're all going to get better at making sure that that's the point that we're actually rewarding value creation. And the other piece that's related to that is that at some point, our technology is going to grow beyond the capabilities that Web3 needs today. And we are building the foundation that's going to help capital allocation across the world. This is going to change the world. I'm convinced of it. And our governance processes are moving so fast and the innovation is so fast. We just have to think bigger. We have to think that let's build for Web3, or not build for Web2. And those foundations, these grant processes that we're putting into place, capital allocation that we're putting in place, we have to be focused on not building for us, but building for IRL. If we do that, then we're going to change the world. And that's kind of what I'm sure a large chunk of us are here for.
Totally. The big thing I look at is, I mentioned earlier in the episode, but there's this old adage, people, process, technology, right? I think sometimes, actually, I think a lot in crypto, we over-index on technology, right? Like we want to build things. We want to continue to build on top of these networks, and that's great. And there's lots of cool things that we've built, but I see more of the potential. And even like in this discussion, it's proven it to me even more, that it's really people process where we have even larger opportunities around, because in some ways, we're kind of overbuilding technology and we're not thinking enough about the outcomes, right? The ROI, like all of these things that are more people and process centric than like the tool, like you can interchange different tools, but if you don't know how you're going to use those tools to achieve what you want and how you're going to work with people to do that, a tool isn't going to do you much good, right? And so it's definitely encouraging to see the groups that are rising up around this. I agree with Shawn. I'm a little bit idealistic that way as well, but I think it's kind of a big deal. I probably wouldn't spend so much time around this stuff if I didn't think that. So yeah, I appreciate both of you coming on the show today. It was a great conversation. I appreciate you working with me on my first time hosting a Greenpill. And so definitely appreciate it, and looking forward to getting this out to the rest of the audience. So thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Nice job, Sam.